2014, 5 Finnish men entered the Plura Cave System, located in the Plurdalen Valley, Norway. Over the course of several horrifying hours, only 3 of the 5 men resurfaced. Faced with the truths of what they witnessed, these 3 men vowed to the wives of their fallen brethren that they would not leave anyone behind. Plura is the deepest known cave system in Rana, Norway, and Northern Europe. Rana is a popular destination for avid cave divers, but many of the underwater systems are not suitable for human exploration. Few accidents have happened in Plura, but that's not to say the cave system hasn't taken its fair share of lives. The visibility is high beneath the surface, but the temperatures are toe-curling. During the harsh Norwegian winters, the surface of Lake Plura freezes over. Despite the icy barrier, Plura is accessible year-round to divers who wish to brave the brisk waters. The popularity of Plura stems from the colorful caves divers come across. Amateur diving hobbyists often dive into the water with the intention of finding and admiring the grotto before returning to Plura. Highly trained and curious individuals may be more inclined to continue on a course that plunges them deeper into the narrow cave system. Divers that choose to venture forward are faced with extremely narrow passages, ice-cold temperatures, and pitch-black water. After navigating a sump, an underground pocket of water, divers will finally ascend to the cave of tragically. Roughly 90 meters above the cave's vaulted ceiling lies the exit of the cave, a crack in the collapsed side of a hill. On February 6, 2014, 2 Finnish divers cut a triangular hole in the ice at Lake Plura before slipping into the water. Encased in waterproof dry suits and heavy diving equipment, they descended quickly into the inky water below. 2 hours later, once the sediment raised by the first diver settled, 3 more men followed behind their friends. The destination for all 5 men was tragically. The Finnish men had met during a prior dive of the Ohamo mine, west of Helsinki. The group custom was that there was no designated leader, but the first to set off was Patrick Gronquist, one of the trio of Finns who had discovered the passage between the 2 systems the year before. His close friend, Jari Huotarinen, accompanied him and was attempting to traverse the tragically for the first time. This trip in particular was on the more extreme end of the dangerous sport. Most amateur divers will restrict themselves to a half hour to an hour at a depth of 30 meters at most. This trip, with the aid of underwater scooters, would be approximately 5 hours to depths of more than 130 meters. The deeper divers traverse, the more dangerous it becomes to navigate. The water is colder, and the tunnels become even more narrow. At such depths, a simple cut from the jagged rocky points could result in death. Diving for this long at depths such as this, the threat of equipment failure or hypercapnia, carbon dioxide poisoning, becomes greater. Cave divers use rebreathers, a device that artificially absorbs the carbon dioxide they exhale. Divers must keep their breathing regulated and steady. If not, the rebreather can be overloaded with carbon dioxide, putting the diver in a dangerous position. Hypercapnia can be deadly, but even a small case can cause confusion and disorient divers. This alone can have serious consequences in the dark caves. Roughly an hour into the dive, Gronquist and Huotarinen had swam through the deepest section of the system, which was about 110 meters lower than the cave entrance. Around this time, Gronquist realized that his friend was no longer with him. Circling back, he found Huotarinen had become stuck in a narrow section of the cave, entangled by a cord connected to his equipment. He was using his flashlight to signal his distress to Gronquist. Huotarinen was starting to panic, which meant he was at risk of hypercapnia. Gronquist gave his friend a cylinder of gas to help reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that was entering his system. But while Huotarinen was switching mouthpieces, the worst happened. Huotarinen started to gasp underwater, filling his lungs with water. To his own horror, Gronquist watched as his friend gasped desperately for air before stilling. He had watched his friend die before his own eyes. Gronquist, for fear of dying himself, forced his breathing to slow. If he allowed himself to grieve for his friend now, Gronquist knew he put himself at risk for hypercapnia too. After a brief moment of attempting to pull Huotarinen free to no avail, Gronquist had no choice but to continue onto tragically as planned. Gronquist faced yet another deadly obstacle on course to the surface: decompression sickness. Divers who have spent time in deep water cannot swim straight to the surface without the risk of decompression sickness. The deeper the dive, the longer the decompression. Because Gronquist had spent nearly an additional half hour at 110 meters, he would have to spend hours making additional stops before surfacing safely. He dreaded the return to the surface, especially without Huatarinen's body in tow. Gronquist knew that the second team would be coming across the scene soon to witness for themselves. Vesa Rantanen was the first diver of the second team and the first to discover Huatarinen's body. Rantanen had to make a decision: turn back now or attempt to pass the dead diver. He eventually decided to go forward, but the extra 15 minutes it took to pass the body added 3 hours to Rantanen's decompression time. Rantanen was forced to surface 80 minutes early, bypassing several decompression stops as his oxygen began to run low. Soon after surfacing, he began to notice pains in his knees and elbows. This was a sign of decompression sickness, often called the bends. The pain grew steadily worse over the following hours. Gronquist and Rantanen would later find out that while Rantanen had been struggling to pass their dead friend, Jari Usimaki was having troubles of his own. The Norwegian police believed that Usimaki panicked upon discovering the body and began to overload his rebreather with carbon dioxide. The fifth and final diver, Kai Kankkonen, attempted to aid Usimaki unsuccessfully. Unlike Rantanen, Kankkonen decided it was best not to push through to Steinugelflaget. Instead, he turned around and made the long trek back to their starting point. Kankkonen resurfaced during the early hours of the night, nearly 11 hours after setting off for the dive. By the time he reached the surface of Plura, he had to break a thin layer of ice to climb out of the water. All 3 surviving divers were hospitalized with decompression sickness. Local authorities took statements from each diver and closed the Plura Cave. During Gronquist's original traverse of the Plura Caves in 2013, Kai Kankkonen and a third team member, Sami Pakarinen, joined him. At the time of the incident, Pakarinen taught a diving course in Mexico. He woke up the next day to a dozen phone calls and messages from the survivors. Pakarinen had trained both of the deceased and counted them as good friends of his. Instead of teaching that day, Pakarinen fielded a Skype call from a British cave diver, Rick Stanton. He was well known for his rescue and recovery work in underwater caves. Stanton had already heard about the accident and was readying himself to assist with the recovery of the 2 divers. Before long, Norwegian police requested the help of Stanton. 2 weeks later, he and 2 other divers, John Volanthen and Jason Mallinson, set off for Steinugelflaget. It became evident to the 3 men that Huatarinen could not be readily freed from the Steinugelflaget side of the tunnel, and his body was blocking access to Usimaki. For a moment, the divers considered returning to their point of origin and attempting the dive backwards, but it proved to be far more dangerous. The recovery was far too risky, and so the Norwegian police called it off. At this point, Gronquist made a promise to Jari Huatarinen's wife. Gronquist told the grieving widow that he would figure out a solution and bring the men back to surface. Even in death, no diver gets left behind, and he was going to make sure he upheld that unspoken rule. Gronquist discovered not long after that his friends all had the same idea. They were just waiting for the message. The 3 survivors plus Pakarinen will be involved in the second recovery attempt. The mission itself had been planned in secret. The men knew that if they asked the Norwegian police for permission, they would be denied access. These men had a rather distinct advantage over the British rescue team though. All 4 men had performed the dive before and felt confident that they could reach their friends' bodies from the Plura side. The only advantage the British team had was the lack of emotional connection to the victims inside the cave. There was no telling how the guys would react returning to the cave and seeing their dead friends floating lifelessly in the dark water. In the month leading up to their departure, Pakarinen and the others tried to process their emotions quickly. They didn't want to panic under the water and risk yet another tragedy happening. On March 22, 2014, a team of 27 divers descended on Plurdalen. 2 teams of support divers would work at the shallower levels of the cave, while Gronquist, Pakarinen, and Kankkonen would dive deep below to retrieve the bodies. Vesa Rantanen, who had suffered a spinal injury caused by decompression sickness, would act as the surface manager. 3 days later, the bodies of Jari Usimaki and Jari Huatarinen were returned to the surface once more. The Norwegian police were pleased that the bodies had been retrieved, but they let the teams know that they had broken several rules in the process. In the following months, funerals for both men were held and the 3 remaining survivors were allowed to properly grieve their loss. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so we can continue bringing these stories to you every week. If you have a video suggestion, leave a comment down below. Until next time.